In the cold winter of 1899, in a small, quiet town near the growing industrial city of Pittsburgh, a poor boy named Daniel Carter walked along a frozen dirt road carrying a small wooden toolbox that belonged to his father, while the factories in the distance filled the sky with dark smoke and loud metal sounds, because America at that time was changing faster than anyone could imagine, and the country was entering a new age of machines, industry, and invention. But Daniel did not know any of those big historical words. He only knew that his family was poor and that his father worked long hours fixing broken machines in a factory where men often lost fingers, hands, and sometimes even their lives. Yet despite the danger, Daniel's father always told him something important every night, that a man who understands machines understands the future. And those words slowly grew inside Daniel's mind, like a seed waiting for the right moment to grow. And one afternoon, while Daniel was helping his father repair a broken engine, a traveling newspaper boy ran through the street, shouting exciting news about two brothers who had built a flying machine and had actually flown through the air. And although many people laughed and said it was nonsense, Daniel later discovered that the event was real, and it would soon be known around the world as the Wright Brothers' first flight. And when Daniel read about it in an old newspaper, his entire view of the world changed, because he suddenly realized that ordinary men with tools and ideas could change history forever. And from that moment, Daniel became obsessed with understanding machines, wind engines, and anything that moved faster than a horse. And while other boys in town spent their evenings playing games, Daniel spent his nights inside his father's small wooden shed, building strange objects from broken metal wheels, springs, and wires, while his mother worried that he was wasting his childhood. But Daniel believed he was building something important, even though he did not yet know exactly what it was. And years later, when the world began hearing about a brilliant but mysterious inventor named Nikola Tesla, Daniel felt another spark of curiosity, because Tesla's strange experiments with electricity, wireless power, and energy from the air made Daniel believe that the future of machines would not just be made of gears and engines, but also invisible forces that humans were only beginning to understand. And so Daniel spent every spare moment reading books about electricity, magnetism, and mechanical design, even though most people in his town thought those subjects were too complicated for a poor factory worker's son. But history has always been changed by people who refuse to accept what others believe is impossible. And Daniel Carter would soon discover that the world was far bigger and far more dangerous than the small, dusty town he grew up in, because within a few short years, a global conflict known as the World War I would erupt across Europe, and the war would demand faster machines, stronger engines, and new inventions that could decide the fate of nations. And although Daniel was still young when the first news of the war reached America, he felt something powerful pulling him toward the world of invention, engineering, and risk. And one evening, while repairing a damaged motor in a train station workshop, he met an older engineer who had traveled across Europe and had seen the earliest airplanes used for military scouting. And the man told Daniel something that would stay with him forever. He said, "The next great revolution will belong to the people who master the sky, because whoever controls the sky controls the future." And those words echoed in Daniel's mind long after the engineer left the workshop. And that night, Daniel stayed awake until sunrise, drawing designs for a machine that he believed could fly farther, faster, and safer than any airplane that existed at the time. But Daniel did not realize that building such a machine would take years of failure, sacrifice, and danger, and that one day his dream would place him in direct competition with some of the most powerful industrial companies in America, companies that would do anything to protect their profits and their secrets. Yet every great story of invention begins with a simple moment of curiosity, and for Daniel Carter, that moment had already begun on a cold winter road in 1899 when a poor boy carried his father's toolbox toward a future that no one else could see. As the years passed, Daniel Carter grew from a curious boy into a determined young man who spent nearly every waking hour surrounded by tools, engines, metal scraps, and notebooks filled with sketches of flying machines. Because the dream that had started after hearing about the Wright brothers' first flight refused to leave his mind. And while most people believed airplanes were nothing more than fragile wooden experiments, Daniel believed they would someday connect continents, carry thousands of passengers, and even change the outcome of wars. And so he worked harder than anyone around him, studying every mechanical system he could find, while reading about the strange electrical experiments of Nikola Tesla and the rapid technological changes happening across America during the early 20th century. And one night in the spring of 1912, while Daniel was repairing a damaged motor inside a noisy railway workshop, an older traveler with tired eyes and a heavy European accent entered the building, carrying a broken mechanical device that looked far more complicated than any engine Daniel had ever seen. And when the man noticed Daniel examining the machine with curiosity, he asked a simple question that would change everything. He asked if the young mechanic believed machines could someday travel faster than the wind. And Daniel, without hesitation, answered yes, because the future belongs to people who believe in impossible things. And the traveler smiled quietly before revealing that he had once worked with experimental aircraft engineers in Europe and had seen early military aircraft being tested for reconnaissance during growing political tensions that would soon explode into what the world would call the World War I. And according to the traveler, the governments of powerful nations were secretly investing enormous amounts of money into faster aircraft, stronger engines, and new technologies that could dominate the sky. Because whoever controlled the sky would control the battlefield. And Daniel listened carefully, realizing that the world he dreamed about in his small wooden shed was already beginning to take shape in distant laboratories and secret workshops across the ocean. And before leaving, the traveler handed Daniel a small notebook filled with strange aerodynamic calculations, wing measurements, and experimental engine ideas, explaining that innovation often begins in the hands of people who are not afraid to fail hundreds of times. And after that night, Daniel worked with an intensity that surprised even his father, building prototype machines, testing new propeller designs, and studying wind patterns across the nearby hills, while newspapers began reporting that the war in Europe was growing larger and more destructive every month. And when the United States finally entered the conflict, Daniel felt a powerful sense that the moment he had unknowingly been preparing for had finally arrived. Because the government suddenly needed engineers, mechanics, and inventors capable of improving aircraft technology. And although Daniel had no formal university degree, his reputation as a brilliant mechanic spread quickly through local factories and workshops, until one day a government recruiter visited the town, searching for talented engineers willing to assist in experimental aviation projects. And within weeks, Daniel Carter left the small town of his childhood and traveled to a massive industrial research facility where hundreds of engineers were racing against time to build faster airplanes for the war effort. But Daniel soon discovered that invention inside a government laboratory was far more complicated than building machines alone in a barn, because powerful corporations controlled manufacturing contracts, military officials demanded immediate results, and secrecy surrounded every experiment. Yet despite the pressure, Daniel continued working late into the night, testing new engine designs, calculating airflow over experimental wings, and slowly developing an idea for an aircraft unlike anything that existed at the time. a design that he believed could fly higher, faster, and farther than the fragile planes currently used in the war. But Daniel did not yet understand that innovation often attracts both admiration and powerful enemies, especially in an industry where billions of dollars and national security are involved. And as his experimental designs began attracting attention inside the facility, whispers of competition, jealousy, and corporate espionage began spreading through the hallways. Because history has always shown that the path of invention is never simple, and the closer Daniel moved toward a breakthrough, the more dangerous his journey would become.
Inside the massive government research facility, Daniel Carter quickly realized that the world of invention was far more competitive and secretive than anything he had imagined during the quiet nights in his father's wooden shed, because hundreds of engineers, mechanics, and scientists worked under strict supervision, designing faster aircraft, stronger engines, and more efficient propellers, while the pressure of the growing conflict in Europe continued shaping every decision made by military officials. And although the war, known as World War I, would eventually end, the race for technological superiority never truly stopped, and Daniel soon found himself surrounded by brilliant minds, some of whom admired his creative thinking, while others viewed him as a dangerous rival, especially after he presented an unusual aircraft concept that combined lightweight structural design with a powerful experimental engine system that he believed could push the limits of speed and altitude beyond what current airplanes could achieve. And while many senior engineers initially dismissed the idea as unrealistic, Daniel continued refining the design late at night, filling notebooks with calculations about airflow, wing curvature, and engine efficiency, inspired partly by the visionary electrical experiments of Nikola Tesla, whose theories about energy and unseen forces had deeply influenced Daniel's imagination. And during those long nights of experimentation, Daniel also began noticing strange patterns inside the facility, including locked laboratories, restricted documents, and sudden visits from powerful industrial representatives who seemed less interested in scientific discovery and more focused on protecting their financial interests, because the rapidly expanding aviation industry in the United States had already begun attracting enormous investments from powerful companies determined to dominate the future of transportation and military technology. And Daniel gradually understood that invention alone would not guarantee success in a world where patents, corporate influence, and government contracts could determine which ideas were allowed to become reality and which would quietly disappear into forgotten archives. Yet, despite the political tension and growing secrecy, Daniel continued pushing forward with his experimental aircraft design, convinced that a machine capable of flying higher, faster, and longer distances could transform both civilian travel and national defense. And one evening, while conducting a late-night engine test inside an isolated hangar, Daniel finally witnessed the first true success of his design, when the prototype engine produced an astonishing level of power while maintaining stability far beyond the limits of conventional engines used during the early aviation era that had begun after the Wright Brothers' first flight. And although the test lasted only a few minutes, Daniel knew he had taken the first real step toward creating something revolutionary. Yet the celebration lasted only briefly, because within days, rumors began circulating that several large industrial corporations were attempting to acquire exclusive control over experimental aircraft technologies developed inside government research programs. And Daniel soon discovered that his own project had quietly attracted attention from executives who believed the design could generate enormous profit if developed under private corporate control rather than public research. And as the pressure from corporate representatives increased, Daniel faced a difficult decision: whether to cooperate with powerful investors who promised wealth and resources, or continue pursuing his dream independently despite the risks. Because history has often shown that the greatest inventions do not emerge without conflict.
And as Daniel Carter stood alone inside the dimly lit hangar, staring at the metal frame of his unfinished aircraft, he realized that the dream that had started many years earlier in a small, dusty town had now become part of a much larger battle involving science, industry, politics, and the future of flight itself. And he could no longer predict whether his creation would lead to success, fame, danger, or disappearance into the shadows of forgotten history. But one truth had become impossible to ignore. The closer he moved toward changing the future of aviation, the more powerful forces would rise to stop him. Standing alone inside the silent hangar, Daniel Carter slowly walked around the unfinished aircraft that had consumed years of his life, and he realized that the machine before him represented far more than metal wings and experimental engines, because it represented every cold winter night he had spent dreaming since the day he first read about the Wright Brothers' first flight, and every lesson he had learned from broken machines, failures, and endless experiments. And although powerful corporations were now offering him wealth and resources in exchange for control over his invention, Daniel remembered the words his father once told him, that a man who understands machines understands the future, and the future must never belong only to those who seek profit, but also to those who believe in progress for everyone. And with that thought, Daniel made the most difficult decision of his life, refusing the corporate contracts and choosing instead to continue his work under the public research program, even though it meant facing financial uncertainty, political pressure, and constant competition from powerful aviation companies. And over the following years, Daniel and a small group of loyal engineers worked tirelessly, improving the aircraft design, transforming the fragile experimental machine into a powerful long-range airplane, capable of flying higher and faster than most aircraft of its time. And as global tensions slowly rose again during the 1930s, Daniel realized that aviation would soon become one of the most important technologies in the world, because the lessons learned during World War I had already proven that control of the sky could determine the fate of entire nations. And when the world was eventually pulled into another devastating conflict known as World War II, many of the design principles Daniel had helped develop years earlier began influencing a new generation of military and transport aircraft that carried soldiers, supplies, and hope across continents and oceans. And although Daniel Carter never became as famous as the early pioneers who first shocked the world with powered flight, his work quietly helped shape the rapid evolution of aviation during one of the most critical periods in modern history. And long after the war ended, commercial airlines began connecting distant cities and countries, fulfilling the dream Daniel had imagined when he was just a poor boy building strange machines inside a wooden shed. And one evening, many years later, as an older man, Daniel visited a busy airport where enormous aircraft lifted thousands of passengers into the sky every day. And while watching one of those giant machines disappear into the clouds, he smiled quietly, realizing that the dream that once seemed impossible had become part of everyday life for millions of people. And in that moment, Daniel understood something important about invention, history, and human progress, that the greatest achievements are not always remembered by name, but they live on in the world they help create. And as the sun slowly set over the runway, Daniel Carter walked away from the airport, knowing that although time had changed many things, the spirit of curiosity, determination, and imagination that once inspired a poor boy in a small dusty town would continue guiding new generations of dreamers who would push the limits of science, technology, and exploration far beyond anything he had ever imagined.